Well, welcome back. Hi, this is Jenny Cochran with Fullness of Grace, and Father Quan Tran is here today, and he's going to continue our discussion of the three stages of the spiritual life. And today we're going to talk about the third stage, which is the Unitive Stage. And this is the highest stage that we can attain.
Right.
And so I'm really curious to hear about it, but I'm thinking maybe you should go back and review the three stages overall and then progress.
Right.
Yeah.
Let's just do a quick recap, and then people can always refer to our other videos.
Okay.
So the first stage of the spiritual life is called the purgative stage. That's when a person turns back from a life of sin. They go through a conversion to turn towards God. So and so that's the purgative stage. And then the second stage is the illuminative stage. And so there's a gateway between the two, and that's the first dark night. It's often referred to as the night of the senses,
Mm-hmm.
the dark night of the senses, or the purification of the senses, because people are still perhaps too attached to the senses, their
Mm-hmm.
consolations, the joys, that closeness that God gives them
Mm-hmm.
to help them to conversion. But in order for them to advance even closer to God, they need to let go of the attachments to the senses. So if they go through that stage, then they reach the illuminative stage. And then there is when they really start to grow closer to God and to grow in virtue. And but then the third stage, which we're going to talk about today, is the unitive stage, which is the highest stage. And then there's a gateway there as well. Before we can get to the unitive stage, we have to go through a stage called, it's the second dark night, or the dark night of the spirit. So this unitive stage, our author, Father Gary Gou-Lagrange, says this is the normative way to sanctity. This is the normative way to sanctity, is that we are to advance as we grow in our life on earth. We're supposed to advance and grow in our spiritual life as well. But he says, unfortunately, this is rare, that people reach the third stage, the unitive stage, even though it's normal, and the saints get there. You know, the saints get there. But most people, unfortunately, don't get there. And so...
And why is it so rare? Is it just too much to give up, or...?
Well, he says it's because of our weaknesses,
Mm-hmm.
and our fear, our fear of suffering, our fear of the cross.
Uh-huh.
And so we're still attached to this world. We're still attached to our senses, and so we're less than generous. The saints are those who are very generous. You know, they give themselves completely to God, and so they're able to advance. They're not afraid to suffer, and they start with a different outlook. They receive a different outlook, and they see the value of suffering, and they want to conform themselves to Jesus, and they really trust in God, and they allow Him to really do and work in them and work through them. But many people are less than generous. We are weak. We are fearful. So therefore, many people do not make it to the unitive stage. And as a result, many people go through purgatory before entering into heaven. But purgatory is really a safety net. It's not the normal course of sanctity.
Mm-hmm.
It's if we're not completely purified yet while we're on earth. So therefore, we have to go to purgatory to be purified in order to be with God face to face in heaven. But the normal way is to go straight to heaven after we leave this earth. And a lot of the saints go straight to heaven because they are purified. They are one with God. So at the unitive stage prepares them to enter heaven. We can start talking about the dark night of the spirit now. So this is the purification. This is an extra. This is sort of like this final purification, and this darkness, and it is really dark. And people, when they're involved with this darkness, they feel like they're so far from God. They feel like they've been abandoned by God. Mm-hmm. And we hear this a lot, you know, with Mother Teresa, for instance. Mm-hmm. You know, that she went through this period where she felt like she was completely abandoned by God. He was nowhere to be found. And so it is really dark. It's sad. It's distressful. But it's necessary for that final purification. Those who go through this second dark night experience a temptation against faith and hope. They start to lose hope. They start to lose faith because God seems to have abandoned them. but yet there was this author speaks that he says that in the dark of the night we can see things that we can't see during the day. And it's true, during the day we can't see the stars, but when it's completely dark we can see stars, we can see galaxies, we can see constellations that we normally couldn't see at night. And so there is this still perception that God that God is there, that He exists, and that He's wonderful, His goodness, His purity, His beauty. So they can see that, but again, they feel distance from God. They feel that He has abandoned them. So there is still this ardent desire for God, and this ardent desire for perfection. But at the same time, everything is dark and difficult. And so this is the second stage that really purifies the person, and it really conforms them to God. It's really about going through what Jesus went through on the cross when He said, my God, why have you abandoned me?" So in his humanity, He felt God had abandoned Him. And so when we go through this, we really experience in a way what Jesus experienced on the cross, feeling abandoned by the Father. And so, but this is necessary for that purification and conformity to Jesus Himself.
Mm-hmm. It seems like that's hard to desire. It's hard to desire so much suffering. I don't know if it's normal for humans to desire so much suffering.
Right.
So how do we, knowing that this is good and this is the way we avoid time in purgatory, how do we move to the point where we would want to go through that?
Well, it doesn't happen overnight. A person progresses. Like you have to go through the purgative stage and to the illuminative stage. And at the illuminative stage, God prepares us for that. We start to be detached from our will and conform to His will. And so we trust in God that nothing happens to us without His permission or without His direct will. So we accept this trial as part of God's will to bring about a greater good. So there's already this faith that there's value to suffering, there's value to the cross. We already know about redemptive suffering and purification. And so at this stage, the author tells us there are three things that we should do. Number one is to patiently endure suffering in conformity to God's will, to trust that God is allowing this to happen in order to bring about a greater good, even though it seems unbearable, to know that God is allowing this to happen to bring about a greater good. And to understand the mystery of the cross. Christ had to suffer, and so we too need to participate in His suffering if we are to conform to Him, if we are to participate in His redemptive work. In a way, we have to. I think St. Paul speaks about that, about his own suffering as making up for what is lacking in the body of Christ, for the good of the church. And so those who are close to God, those who are called to the unitive stage, they really participate in Christ's suffering and redemptive work in a radical way, as to be conformed to Him, as to make their work, their vocation fruitful. And then the last thing that the author speaks about is to try to be firm in hope, be firm in hope and constant prayer, right? Don't give up, just believe that God is with you and that everything will turn out well. And this is a road to the greater good. And to don't give up prayer, right? Even though God seems so far away, He seems to abandon us, just know by faith that He hears us, and to keep it up.
This reminds me of the St. Ignatius spiritual exercises, the rules of discernment. And Rule 8 is that to keep in mind that this will not last forever, and that it could be a trial for us, but it's for our good, and to keep up prayer.
Right.
So would that apply in this
yes,
case too?
So to be patient.
Yeah.
To be patient and to know that God gives us the grace, right? That He doesn't allow us to suffer anything beyond our ability. That whatever He allows us to endure, He gives us the grace to endure. So that's important to keep in mind.
Yeah. Okay. Now tell me about virtues. I think virtues are vastly changed here.
Right. So here we're talking about heroic virtues,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, so I think the tests for sainthood, for canonization, is heroic virtue. So there are four elements to heroic virtue.
Mm-hmm.
One is that you accomplish something that's difficult. That's very difficult beyond human strength to endure.
Mm-hmm.
So something very difficult, and then you accomplish it promptly and easily,
Mm-hmm.
right? Promptly and easily. And number 3, with holy joy, with holy joy. And number 4, you do it frequently, whenever the situation arises. So that's heroic virtue. A lot of it could be persecution,
Mm-hmm.
suffering. You just endure it promptly and easily and with joy, and every time it arises. We don't lose our peace. We don't react violently or with aggression or anger, but to endure that. So that's just one example of heroic virtue. But this is heroic. This is an elevated, a higher form of virtue,
Mm-hmm.
one that we don't normally see. And again, number 4 is this happens habitually. Every time the situation arises, it's not like once in a while we can be heroic, but not consistently.
Yeah.
At least not yet.
Yeah.
Right.
I thank God for the gift of Mother Teresa, because Saint Mother Teresa, because we saw that heroic virtue in her life. Where who of us would go work with the poorest of the poor in the slums of Calcutta?
Mm-hmm.
Which of us will hold up these people with leprosy and
Mm-hmm.
hold them and love them? I mean, that's so heroic.
Right. That
Yeah.
You're right. That's difficult. She does it promptly and easily.
Uh-huh.
She does it with joy, and she does it routinely.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
that's a sign of heroic virtue right there. Heroic charity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what would heroic charity, I wonder, look like in our lives? Because we obviously weren't planted in Calcutta, and we're here in, in this culture.
Right.
And,
So there's 2 parts to charity. The first part is to God.
Mhm.
So heroic charity to God is to accept everything as coming from His will and conforming to His will,
Okay.
right? And to have faith in Him. And then heroic virtue to others is desiring their salvation, right?
Mhm.
Desiring their greatest good and radiating goodness everywhere. An example of this is Saint Therese of Lisieux. I think she writes in her biography that there was one sister in particular that was very difficult, that was
Mhm.
very demanding, and nobody wanted to be around her. But Saint Therese made an effort to be close to her, to help her, and to always smile, to be joyful around her. And at the end, I think after Saint Therese passed away, this saint said that they were such close friends, right?
Uh-huh.
This saint, I mean, this sister had no idea how difficult it was for Saint Therese,
Uh-huh.
right? To be kind, to be gentle, to be patient, to be loving, to be joyful around her.
Yeah.
And then so that's heroic virtue. That's heroic charity, right? To be around somebody who's very difficult, demanding, but you wouldn't show that they were bothering you at all. You would be at their service, and you would love them and be patient with them and smile and be joyful and serve them day in and day out.
I'm so glad you brought up Saint Therese of Lisieux and the little way, because
Mhm.
when I think about Mother Teresa, I just think I don't know if I would ever get to that level of sanctity, but I can work on being more loving and more patient, and to kind of follow the little way, her little way.
Well, let's talk about once you pass the unitive way, once you pass the dark night of the spirit. Let's just talk about what this unitive stage looks like.
Okay.
So there is this almost continuous union with God, right? You're always thinking about God. You're always speaking to God, and you know Him and you love Him. So you've passed the difficult part. So now you're in the unitive stage.
Okay.
So you know how we are. That we usually think to ourselves, we talk to ourselves, and now instead of that, it has shifted to God. Our thoughts are always with God and about God, and so we're speaking to God, we're thinking about Him, and we're loving Him. Our life is just constantly united to God. Yeah. So those who are in the unitive way have this constant habitual recollection too. Right? Remember how it's difficult for us to be recollected and to be focused because we're so distracted and easily agitated, and so they are are almost continuously, habitually recollected, and they contemplate God constantly, continually. So they're always one with God, and they're being conformed to God. And St. John of the Cross speaks about like wood that is that receives fire. So fire is God, we are the wood. So the fire slowly first dries the wood, and then the wood takes on the quality of the fire, right, when it catches on fire. And so that's what it is. So they are united to God like wood that is inflamed in fire. They take on the qualities of God himself. So this is that sort of like this transformation. They are becoming like God because they are so intimately united to God in recollection, in contemplation, in love, in conversation, in thought, heart. You know. So that's what the
Beautiful.
unitive way looks like. And another element the author speaks of is they can't help but speak about God. Right? And this reminds me of St. Dominic. There's a saying that he either spoke about God or to God. He was either speaking to God or about God. And that's what the unitive way is about. You're either speaking to God or about God. There's nothing else. Right? Because you're consumed with God. You're either loving him and speaking to him, and when you're not, you're telling other people about him because he is your everything. And so those who are in the unitive way can't help but speak about God because it's like spilling over, right? I mean, they're just so consumed and absorbed and in love with God. It just flows out of them naturally. You know, they just can't wait to tell people about God and so on. So those are some of the qualities of this unitive way. And then there are different forms. There's one form that's called the Life of Reparation. Now this isn't for everybody, but some are called to this life of reparation in which they share in the cross of Christ in a radical way. They are called to be victims, to die, to suffer for souls, for the sanctification of souls in reparation for sins. And I believe Saint Mother Teresa was this. They say it's like a prolonged dark night of the spirit. You know, she suffered for like this for 50 years. So she had been purified. She did not need 50 years to be purified. But the reason it was prolonged because she was called to make reparation. This is a life of reparation. She was called to suffer for the sanctification and the salvation of others. And so I think we hear this about some of the other saints as well. You know, I think St. Paul of the Cross, the founder of the Passionists, he suffered tremendously, and so on. Yes, some souls are called to be victim souls, to suffer with Christ in his work of salvation. So that's one form. And then there's a couple of types of unions that we should talk about. So one is called the ecstatic union. So in this union, there's a suspension of exterior senses, right? Because the person is so engrossed, so absorbed in God. This is ecstasy. You know, we see the image of Saint Teresa in ecstasy, right? And so she really is in ecstasy. She doesn't know what's going on around her. She's so absorbed in God. Sometimes this will be accompanied by levitation, but not necessarily. Now, levitation is an extraordinary gift, extraordinary mean. But even the normal mean of ecstasy, you're so absorbed with God, you're so consumed with him, you don't really know what's going on around you. And sometimes that person needs to snap out of it by like a superior telling her to say, okay, stop, okay, right?
Really?
Right? Go back to
Wow.
work, because it could be for minutes, it could be brief, or it could be for hours.
Wow.
But there's a state of ecstasy, ecstatic union. And then the final union, which is the sort of like the prize, the fruits of the unitive way, is called the transforming union, sometimes called the spiritual marriage, where you are really, or a spousal union with God. And so a person who's going through this transforming union, they are constantly drawn to the center of their soul, where the Trinity dwells. They really experience the Holy Trinity dwelling in them in a radical way in which we don't experience. Of course, we understand it and we can contemplate that, but on a much more superficial level. Here they really experience the Holy Trinity. They see the differences between the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, but at the same time they see their unity. So there's this exposure, this union. There's this closeness with the Holy Trinity. They get a glimpse of this is the next best thing to heaven, where you really experience and see God face to face and see what it's like. But this is very close, but it's not there yet, of course. Again, this person becomes like God. They're being transformed into the likeness of God. And here's another special thing. Those who are going through this transforming union, there is the confirmation in grace. God gives them a special protection to preserve them from mortal sin. In a way,
Yeah.
and they almost like Mary, the Blessed Virgin Mary, you know. But yeah, so when they've reached this stage, they're so close to God, they are so pure that God protects them from committing a mortal sin or even a deliberate venial sin. And so this is all a prelude to heaven, right? So those who've gone through the unitive stage, through the transforming union, the next stage is heaven. When they pass from this life, they're expected to reach heaven. And again, this is normative for all of us, yet it is rare because many of us are weak, we're ignorant, and we're afraid to suffer. But if we, with God's grace, and we follow the steps and we are generous, we all may experience this unitive stage and transforming union.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for explaining this. And until next time, this is Jenny Cochran with Fullness of Grace.